Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, so here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. MC McDonald. MC, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So MC is a trauma researcher, author, and certified life coach. She spent over a decade researching trauma, grief, and resilience, and she's written several scholarly articles and 3 books on trauma and mental illness. She says if she could snap her fingers and change just one thing about the way we understand trauma, it would be this: that at its core, the trauma response is a strength response, not a sign of weakness or disorder. When we begin there, healing from trauma is possible. Awesome. All right, MC, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yay. Hello.
So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I am from the East Coast, from Massachusetts, and I'm currently in California. I made the move out west.
When did you make the move? I did the same move.
Oh, did you? Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
So I had a research I was doing a research project I'm trying to remember, 2019, and I've been here since. I just stayed.
Oh, so recently.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I left the East Coast and moved west. So it seems like a natural transition for a lot of us.
It does. And there's a particular, like an East Coast person who stays East and then an East Coast person who moves West. Those are 2 different East Coast people.
We'll have to talk about that in another episode.
Yes.
So how did this interest start for you? Break it down.
It was a really strange path, to be honest. I would love to say that it was this like linear path that made sense. And it really didn't. I was housed in a philosophy department. I was doing my degree in philosophy for my bachelor's. And then I got really interested in psychoanalysis when I was doing my master's degree and started studying the psychoanalysis and the history of mourning. And that's what I ended up doing my research project on for my master's degree. And in the course of that time, both of my parents passed away really suddenly. They both had cancer that was undiagnosed. And so they both died in quick succession while I was studying mourning, which was wild. And then I moved on to my PhD program and I embarked on an interdisciplinary project, which some of your listeners will know is never looked kindly upon in academia. And I was looking at trauma from the perspective of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. And the goal was essentially to synthesize 150 years of study and try to kind of set the course right so that when we're talking about trauma, we know what the history is and also what the science has brought us to now, because I think the societal definition hasn't really caught up yet with the science. And so it's been a very a winding path. Even saying it that way kind of it makes it seem coherent in a way that it wasn't at the time. Mm-hmm. And I stress that because I think it's important to emphasize to people that the path isn't always linear, and that's okay. You don't always have to know what you're doing when you embark, or even in the middle of the journey, to be honest.
Well, it certainly was the case for me. Sorry about that. So you said you wanted to set the history straight, the core straight. At what point were you when you said something is off here?
So when I was actually trying to do a project on identity, and I was studying, there was a debate at the time in the philosophy of mind about the extent to which, if at all, the self is constituted by a narrative. And I wanted to make an argument that the self is indeed constituted by a narrative, at least in important part. And I reached for trauma as a case study because I kept hearing in these cases, anyone who talked about trauma, and this was also my own experience, said that the story they were telling, sometimes they didn't even realize they were telling it, shattered at the moment of trauma. And that seemed to me to be a good sort of a use case for, a piece of proof that said we are constituted narratively, whether we recognize it or identify with that narrative or not. And so I reached into psychology to kind of honestly to grab the definition of trauma. And then I was going to be on my way and make a larger claim about the self and identity.
In and out, cleanly.
Right, exactly. And I realized really quickly that this was up for debate, that the field of psychology was still arguing about what kinds of events constituted trauma, what didn't. And so I was able to go to some of the APA meetings where they were discussing the new criteria for trauma when the DSM-5 was about to come out. And I was shocked at how much debate there was. Is this an injury? Is it a disorder? What kinds of things are trauma? What kinds of things aren't? How do we make this list? And it just seemed to me like I had this thought, like, God, we have to be able to do this better. Like what? We've been studying this for a long time, not in a sustained way, but at least since the late 1800s. And so what is the deal? And that's when I started kind of reaching into different disciplines and putting things together almost just for myself. Like, what is the scope here of the problem? Where did this originate and why are we here? And then I started realizing that this might be work that would be beneficial for other people to read.
Wow. So
lots there.
Me,
yeah.
Well, yeah, there was a lot there. Part of me just wants to say, what did you find?
In which part?
Well, before you answer, this is very interesting because I've interviewed a zillion people on this podcast and many have varying definitions of what trauma is, of course. So what was your understanding of what trauma was when you dove into this?
That it was an event that shifted the timeline and potentially your personality. One of the first definitions of trauma in a psychological aspect versus a physical trauma had said that the trauma is something that is intense enough to change the nature of your personality. And that to me seemed pretty accurate. And then we had this whole history of trauma where we were saying that trauma only affects women, that it was a result of a wandering uterus, that no, just kidding, it only affects soldiers who have been exposed to percussive blasts to their brain and they have essentially a brain injury. Nope, wait, it applies to soldiers who haven't been exposed to these concussive blasts. And so, okay, wait, just there's the issue of domestic violence. Like there were these kind of moments as in the history where we tried to specify who is even struggling with trauma and what constitutes a traumatic event. And I think that when we look critically at a field, it's really important to take the context of the history into account because we often end up sort of importing other definitions into our belief system without realizing it. And so, for example, for example, I think still, even though we are very far from saying that trauma results from a wandering uterus, we still associate it with weakness and a kind of negative femininity. And you can see this pop up in combat populations where veterans are dealing with PTSD and they're being told by other service members and sometimes honestly their clinicians that they just need to kind of buck up and become real men. And that is the proof that we've imported this old bad definition that was based in bad science that has been corrected. We now know from a biological perspective that the trauma response is automatic and adaptive and evolutionary. We come to this earth with fight, flight, and freeze to help us cope with overwhelm. We have a stress response system that is designed to handle incredible amounts of stress. And then sometimes those adaptive mechanisms become over time maladaptive. And that's when we have the distress that comes with something like PTSD. The science is very clear on that. It's not really up for debate. It's not rocket science. Of course, there's many more areas and layers that we will be able to discover. But I think there's still that disconnect in definition, which is a very long way to answer your question.
So where are you now? Kind of in summation, how would you, well, let me ask you this question first. How would you say that the mental health establishment, the psychological establishment defines trauma?
Mhm. So it kind of depends on who you ask, as I'm sure you know, and everyone on your podcast has had a different definition. And then there are people who sort of use the clinical Bible, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, which your readers probably know about, which specifies that there are currently 3 things that can count as potentially traumatic. And then you have clinicians interpreting that Bible, and clinicians will either be will stay very close to that definition and say that if you don't have exposure to these 3 things, which is like death or threatened death, serious injury, sexual assault, those are, I think, the 3 things that count currently in the DSM as potentially traumatic. And you have clinicians who are going to interpret that very literally, and clinicians who are going to be much more open about that and say that there are many things that could potentially be traumatic stressors. Let's look at the definition. I think that the psychological institution, the big machine, is broken, and that we need to start correcting that from the ground up, because that's the only way you can kind of fix a broken institution. That's not to say that there aren't amazing clinicians who are doing incredible work in the institution. But I think that the definition of trauma that makes more sense is you have a potential trauma when you have 2 things happen. One, you have an unbearable emotional experience, and that can either be unbearable in the moment or become unbearable over time. And 2, that lacks a relational home. So anytime you have an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home, you have a potential for trauma. And the reason I like that definition is because it raises the bar sufficiently high so that we don't get to say that anything is potentially traumatic, right? Like, there was no more pumpkin spice syrup at Starbucks, and I have PTSD and can't go back to that Starbucks. That's kind of a misuse of the term. Unbearability raises the bar sufficiently high, and a relational home provides sort of a roadmap for what we need when we are looking to heal from trauma. And I think one of the key things that we need to look at when we're looking at what are we doing when we're healing from trauma is integrating something that sort of defied integration in the first place, was too overwhelming to be integrated. Mm-hmm. And so in cases like that, we need other people to help us integrate what couldn't be integrated. And that's a relational home, which is a space you can have someone help you bear what was unbearable.
Now, is that definition broad enough to include the differences, say, between PTSD that might arise from like a car accident compared to an interpersonal trauma?
I think so, because I think that unbearability lies with the individual who experienced the event. We don't get to decide from on high, this thing was traumatic and this thing was not. We can say, look, you worked in, let's say, to give an example, you worked in a toxic work environment with a very controlling boss for 5 years who made you feel inadequate and like you were on the edge of being fired every single day. You were at that workplace for at least 8 hours a day every day and probably thinking about it a lot more. That over time, like in any given day, might not have seemed like a big trauma, right? But over time, that wears away at your sense of self and your sense of confidence and makes you constantly feel like you are in a very precarious situation in terms of your career and your finances. And so over time, that would clearly be unbearable. And so then that's potentially traumatic.
So you're talking about kind of a broken machine. What do you feel it is broken in terms of the understanding of or the definition of trauma?
So there's so many things. I think that, and this is like, part of this is because the institution of psychology, like capital P, is a huge unwieldy institution. And anytime an unwieldy institution is trying to do something, they have to take into account 500,000 layers that the layperson isn't really thinking about when we're talking about like, how would we personally define a traumatic event? And so I want to say that I'm not trying to slam the institution, but I think that the institution has become entangled with insurance companies in such a way that we have to define things very specifically. And that includes like, okay, you have to have timelines for suffering and timelines for treatment, and things get parsed out in a way that is, that has to do with finances rather than mental health. And so I think that that's one issue. I think that another issue is that when it comes to defining any mental disorder, but certainly trauma, the field of psychology is trying to say, okay, we want to make sure we define this in a way that doesn't stretch the term to meaninglessness. We don't want to be able to say that anything is potentially traumatic. We don't necessarily want the patient or the client to always get to decide what is trauma, just like a patient might not always be able to determine what distress looks like for them. But we want to give them enough power so that they have input. And then we don't want to make the definition so narrow that we miss entire populations of people that are suffering and then misdiagnose. So it's really a tricky problem. And I think the field ends up kind of pendulating between those two extremes where you stretch the word to meaninglessness or you make it so narrow that it's kind of ridiculous instead of striking a balance, because what that balance requires is that you hold things to be that are potentially contradictory to be true at the same time. And you give the patient some autonomy to decide what they're experiencing, but also you have some basis of what kinds of things are potentially traumatic. You know, it's like they're trying to make a list out of something that is impossible to make a list out of.
Mm-hmm. And how does this kind of ambiguity impact therapists potentially?
I mean, I think people are really stuck, right? Like it can come out in a number of ways. Number one, you know, as you know, most clinicians don't really get a training in trauma. And part of that is because of the sort of staccato history of the study of trauma. It hasn't been a thing that we have studied in a sustained way. It has these like peaks and valleys. And so it hasn't really been a stable part of the curriculum when you get training, unless you choose that as a research specialization or something like that. And that's improving a lot. But I think that's one place that things can get really tricky is that clinicians can be out in the field, certainly now in 2023, where we have just been going through a global traumatic event with little to no training on how to recognize and treat trauma. So that's one thing. Two is I think, and this is true of other things in the DSM and other mental illnesses and things like that, clinicians are really left to interpret based on not just what the DSM says and their training says, but also what their practice says and their own personal experience. And so that can go in one of any number of ways. Mm-hmm. And then I think the third thing is that there's this hyper focus. I would love to see this change in the field on choosing a singular modality of treatment. And so if you do dialectical behavioral therapy, that's your specialization, and you treat every client that you see with dialectical behavioral therapy, which is wonderful if you're in a DBT, practice and you're seeing folks who are known to be, have something that DBT would be super helpful for. But if you only have one tool, then I think that's really tricky. And we tend to blame clinicians for that, but we need to blame the institution, because it's the institution that is training clinicians to believe that one or two tools is enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
it's like that adage, if you have a hammer.
Exactly. Yes. Everything is a nail. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Let me
right.
just pause here for one moment. Sure. We're talking with MC McDonald. Just want to pause a moment to thank our sponsors here. All right. So, yeah, really interesting. And yet at the same time, when we're talking about treatment modalities, mm-hmm. therapists already are stymied. What the hell do I do? Do I choose this modality? And what I have to invest in another modality too? How do they become equipped to efficiently, effectively, in a healthy way, treat trauma?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think again, it's so tricky because we have the tendency to turn right to the clinician and place the blame and then therefore the responsibility to change on the clinician. And I think the reality is that if we want to better treat folks who are dealing with trauma, we need to change the education. And we need to change the frame that clinicians have and the access that they have to different modalities and different certifications and, continuing education credits and things like that need to be more mm-hmm. accessible. And also people need practices where they have enough time to be able to pursue these other interests, or if they realize that there maybe is a hole in their training, they need to be able to take time to get a certification, which, as you know, at the moment is really difficult because everyone is so maxed out. I think in the United States, it's like there's 6 patients for every hour, every clinical hour. That's a huge systemic problem. And so I think that the resolution can't really lie in the clinician's hands. That being said, if you're a clinician right now and you're looking for more help, I think trauma is one of the areas where there's a lot of there are a lot of resources that you can access kind of on your own time to get some more understanding about what trauma looks like and how to treat it in your practice. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, of course, Thomas Hübel's work, Reesma Menakem. I think the book Unbroken can potentially help. That's my book that just came out in March. And I think, just kind of getting clear about what you're looking at is a realistic first step. When is a behavior potentially in response to trauma? How might you recognize that as a clinician? And then also how and where to refer clients out when you realize, okay, I don't have training in this. And so where can I send them? I think another hopeful area, I don't want to be too like Debbie Downer here. Another really hopeful area is in the space of coaching and in group modalities. Because, there's some really exciting research in positive psychology that shows that when we're helping other people, we also can sort of remap the brain a little bit away from the trauma response and the fear center. And so in a group modality where you are witnessing other people's pain and more people are getting helped at the same time, and maybe you're connecting with other group members around a similar trauma, you're creating that space for a relational home in a non-clinical setting, but that still might be therapeutic. So I think there's a lot of hope. We just have to keep marching forward. And my big concern is that we will turn away from the study of trauma again, as we have, 4 other times in the history of the study in the last 150 years. And that, I'm sure, scares you as well.
So you mentioned the book Unbroken. The title rather is Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, and other things you need to know to take back your life. Why did you write this book, and who is it for?
Great question. So I wrote the book because, again, going back to this idea of I had a very nonlinear path. When I was in grad school, I got a coaching certification. And part of the reason for that was because I wasn't sure I was going to get an academic job, right? Being an interdisciplinary scholar, people are like, you're unemployable. And then I was also, I wanted to play with the idea of practicing clinically, but I felt like if all of my research was about criticizing the field, that it felt a little bit insincere to go get a clinical license. And so I started coaching. And so I have about 11 years of practice with folks who are dealing with trauma from a coaching perspective. And so I had this academic career in trauma and looking at trauma critically from these 3 disciplines. And I had my own personal experience. And then I had these coaching clients that I was working with, and I was doing research projects. I worked with previously incarcerated folks and veterans on reintegration post-incarceration and combat, which obviously both of those things include a lot of trauma. And so I thought in 2020, what if I synthesized this? And instead of writing academically, I wrote for a general audience. And what would that look like? And so the book is split into client stories, science and history, and then tools so that you can recognize your own story, maybe other people's stories that and then also be empowered to understand what's going on in your nervous system and how to feel a little bit more control over it.
Can you pick out maybe an example in the book of a particular case study, for example?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is the biggest barriers to healing trauma currently is the shame and stigma that we have around it. And this circles back to the definition that we've been talking about. When we define trauma really narrowly, then we dismiss our own traumatic events because we don't feel like they're enough to be traumatic. And so there's a chapter where I talk about referred pain, which is this kind of strange biological experience where The most common example is like you have a toothache and you go to the dentist thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to need a root canal or something really, offensively expensive.
Mhm.
And then they tell you to go to the emergency room because there's nothing in your teeth. It's actually referred pain from your heart. And that's presenting in such a way. So in that situation, the source of the pain isn't what you think it is. And so there's a case study in the book of a client who was a first responder. And she was working in disaster zones. And so she was exposed to other people's trauma. And we know that vicarious traumatization is a thing. And she had all the symptoms of PTSD, but she loved her job. And whenever she talked about her job, I just got the feeling like there doesn't seem to be any sign of distress here. She feels empowered when she goes to these places. She feels connected. She feels there doesn't seem to be a sense of like moral injury where she's starting to lose her faith in the structure of the world. It just didn't seem like the source. And over the course of our conversations, all of the stuff that I was talking about the trauma response resonated with her, but it didn't like seem to attach to the work stuff. So we couldn't really figure out what was going on. And she had mentioned a couple of times in passing that she had this breakup. And she's like, I don't want to talk about that. That's not traumatic. It's just a dumb breakup. I only dated this guy for 2 years. Not a big deal. So she was issuing a lot of judgment and shame about the role of this event in her life, given the exposure she was having to all these other traumas. But when we dug into it and sat with it for a minute, this was an incredibly traumatic breakup. And she had thought, yes, she was only with this person for 2 years, but they had been shopping for homes together. They were talking about their future. He left in a very shocking, sudden way. He had another relationship. She had no sign that anything was wrong in the relationship. And all of a sudden it was over. And so this was the thing that had caused the traumatic symptoms, but we were looking at the wrong source. It was like we were looking at the tooth and she was having a heart attack. And I think the reason that I want to talk about that example in particular in this conversation is that we've been talking about the definition of trauma and why it's important to get it right. And I think when we don't get it right, we miss the source of pain. And when you miss the source of pain, you don't heal it. Like she was going to quit her job because she thought that it was contributing to all these symptoms, right? And so these have real, measurable effects when we're getting the definition wrong.
It's just a really good point. It's so easy for us to minimize our own experiences when we're talking about or looking at someone's sexual assault or rape
totally.
or combat experience.
Totally.
No,
right.
my breakup didn't traumatize me at all.
Right.
Meanwhile, our life is in shambles.
Right. And it's interesting too, because I think we don't draw the parallel. If we both had appendicitis last night and we both went and had our appendices removed, we wouldn't be comparing. I wouldn't be saying mine was inflamed to this point and yours wasn't. And so mine's more important, or yours was more inflamed than mine, or you know what I mean? Like we wouldn't draw that distinction in other medical spaces. So why are we doing it here? Why are we making that hierarchy?
In the book, in the description rather, you say the trauma response is never wrong.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I think that, again, going back to this idea of shame, when we look from a neurobiological perspective at the trauma response, what it is a set of default responses that, again, we come programmed with that are designed to help us out in moments of extreme overwhelm. And so to say that the trauma response is wrong or that it's something that we should be ashamed of is like saying that being hungry is wrong or having to go to sleep because you're tired is wrong. It's a biological reality that is there to keep us alive. And when we understand that and can metabolize that the trauma response is actually a strength response rather than a sign of weakness or disorder, then I think we can peel away some of the shame that gets in the way of healing. So you have this trauma response and it's adaptive, but over time it's become maladaptive. So these alarms are going off in the wrong place. And so how do we recalibrate the nervous system? How do we integrate what hasn't been integrated? That's the work of trauma healing. None of that needs shame, right? We don't need to be ashamed of any piece of that, either the adaptation or the adaptation moving into the space of maladaptation. So I think when we start there, healing becomes a lot more possible. When we view the trauma response as something that is broken about us or that is wrong, then we start with shame. And that's like trying to climb up a mountain with a car strapped to your ankle. Like you're making it so much harder for yourself.
Right.
You know?
I mean, it's so easy. I can't handle this. I'm being negatively impacted by this experience. I'm weak.
Right.
How could I be so weak? And that person over there, they didn't have that response, right?
Right. Or the last time I went through this, I didn't have that response, right? Because I think the other thing that we don't take into account is that what is overwhelming for you today might look very different than what was overwhelming for you 10 years ago or 10 years from now. And so, yeah.
So the book is for, as you said, not just academics, but for lay people as well. So therapists can definitely take advantage of this.
Yeah, I think for therapists, especially for folks, it's one of the things that I intended it to be, and I've heard a lot of positive feedback about this, is that it's an easy read. So one of the things that I think is tricky about some of the other books that have come out is that they have much more of a textbook style. And so they're kind of a slog to get through. Yes, there's tons of amazing information and all that, but for a regular layperson or a therapist who doesn't have training in the field at all, it's a slog to get through a textbook. And this is digestible and easy to read. So it could be useful, a starting point for anyone, a therapist who wants to brush up on their understanding of trauma and read some case studies, for an individual who feels like they might be struggling with trauma, but they're not sure. And also for people who are surrounded by other folks who are dealing with trauma. So families of veterans, people who have a family member who's had an assault or who's just struggling with, life in 2023, which I can't emphasize enough is traumatic, So, yeah.
For the therapists listening who are kind of bombarded with all the different modalities out there, what are your initial thoughts on strong modalities that are out there for treating trauma, ones that you would say, ones that are on your radar as this looks really good? And of course, with the understanding that different people respond differently to different modalities.
Yeah. So I think before we even get to modalities, I think to answer a question you didn't ask, I think that if all therapists had a baseline understanding of the trauma response and could normalize and contextualize symptoms for clients, that's an amazing starting point. I think psychoeducation as a modality goes a really long way for someone to realize, okay, this symptom that I'm having, this nightmare that I keep having, or this hypervigilance that's getting in the way of my relationships and turning into irritability with my family. If I can understand that that's normal and expected, and also something I can potentially intervene on and control, that is a huge first step. That's a great foundation. And then in terms of other modalities, I think that narrative therapy is very helpful when it comes to trauma healing, because so if trauma is essentially like a wound of memory, a critical part of the healing process is working with the fragmented memory in one way or another. And when you're in a therapist's office who's well-versed in narrative therapy, you can kind of work with the story in a way that gives your nervous system an immediate sense of peace in a way. And I think that modality gets kind of underutilized, in my opinion. And I think IFS, internal family systems, is very useful. Somatic experiencing therapy is very useful. When you work with trauma, as with anything, you have to understand that the body is along for the ride. And so whatever you're experiencing in the psyche, you're experiencing in the body. And so working on a somatic level, I think, is really helpful, especially for folks who feel really stuck, like who feel like they've done a bunch of therapy, they've done a bunch of work, they've tried some of these modalities, they work well. And then EMDR is another modality that I think is really, really helpful. Again, none of these are a panacea.
Sure.
And this is another thing I think that is broken about the sort of single modality model, is that we're like, okay, everyone just needs to do EMDR and then no one will be struggling. And EMDR is super, super helpful. And it's probably never going to be the case that you can do like 12 sessions of anything and then it's over. The other space that I see a ton of exciting research in is in the space of psychedelics when it comes to PTSD in particular, and in PTSD that resists other treatment modalities. Mm-hmm. I want to stress and emphasize intensely that it's important that this is done in a setting where you have help, because the integration of the psychedelic experience is as important as the psychedelic experience. And I've had some clients, I don't know if you've seen this too, who've had some really traumatic experiences in using these medications in an unsupervised setting.
Awesome. So, you have written books, several books. You mentioned coaching. Are you currently working with people? And if so, how?
Yes. So I'm full at the moment, but I am working with people one-on-one. I have a coaching practice at alchemycoaching.life. That's where people can find me. And I'm also on TikTok and Instagram. It's the same handle. It's just mc.phd. So if people want little bite-sized pieces of information, I'm there. I hope to be opening my practice to some group modalities in the next year. So Stay tuned to that as well.
Okay. Once again, the website is alchemycoaching.life. And we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. The book is Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong. We'll also have that linked up. MC, fascinating, so inspiring. My God, you're doing amazing work.
Thank you.
Love to have you back later.
Absolutely.
Time.
Oh, anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be in touch.